You're listening to the Call Kent podcast, where Kent C. Dodds answers questions and gives insights to software engineers like you. Now, let's hear the call.
Hi, my question is about render props in 2023. I work at a place and render props kind of got introduced pretty heavily recently into our code base, and it's a new pattern. And it seems like it's being used kind of like all over the place willy-nilly. And we have a lot of custom hooks. But my question is, I read your article from 2018 about, where is it still good to use render props? And you list some examples, but I'm wondering if that's changed in the meantime. So if that article is still your latest thinking on the subject, then cool. But I'm wondering, I'm not really digging them. I'll just say that much. But I'm curious what your thoughts are. Thanks a lot.
And that was the call. Here's what Kent had to say.
Hey, Keldon, thanks for the question. This is good. The blog post is still pretty relevant. I don't think that I would change anything about it, so I'll link to it in the description of this episode. But the hooks, so render props were really useful before hooks came around for sharing logic, and then hooks showed up, and now we can share logic really well. Render props were also really useful for layout components where you don't want to have to make an entire extra like compound component that implicitly shares that logic or something, or you want to expose some specific state or mechanisms for updating state to specific areas that need to be rendered. So I should just say with the specific use case I'm talking about, like a virtual list, it would be a good example, like React Virtualized. Or also the await component, that is a new component in the React Router package with the defer functionality, where you can, in your loader, you can say, I want to defer this promise. And so then React Router will actually render your route and give you a promise that you can then pass into the await component. And that can be used as a render prop API. And so the render prop itself will be called when the awaited promise is resolved. I think that's a perfect use case for render props. So yeah, render props have kind of fallen out of favor just because we have hooks, but they definitely still have their place. If all you're doing is trying to share logic, then hooks are a nice solution. But sometimes because of the limitations of hooks, the rules of hooks and things, having to create an entire new component just so that you can consume a hook is annoying. And so the await example is a really good example of that, where if you say use loader data, you get your data and that has a promise on it. And then if you want to be able to consume that promise, then you have to make a separate component that can say, okay, I want to consume the awaited or the resolved version of this promise, and then render that component. And you can totally do that. There's an API for that. I think it's like use deferred value or something like that. But I am personally of the opinion that I want to make my components as large as reasonable. I don't like breaking up my components. And I guess I'll link to another article that I have about when to break up your components. I don't really like breaking up my components into a bunch of smaller pieces. And so hooks kind of necessitate that sometimes, and I really like to avoid that. So for something like the awaited component, it makes a lot of sense to use that as a render prop. So I totally still see value in having render props as a pattern that people use in the React ecosystem today. But yeah, lots of the use cases for render props were kind of done away when hooks showed up. And Downshift, which is probably the library that made render props as popular as they are, it still does support render props. The class component is still there, but there were new hooks that were introduced that I typically use instead if I'm using Downshift. So anyway, hope that's helpful, and I hope you have a nice day.
This has been the Call Kent podcast. Learn more about Kent at kentcdodds.com and get your own questions answered at kentcdodds.com/calls.